This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details. This month marks the 35th anniversary of the Legend of Zelda series. Over the past decade or so, we've seen Zelda's history celebrated with a pretty regular trickle of remakes and remasters. While Nintendo will almost certainly do something for Zelda's big 3-5, Justin Berube and I decided to come up with our own personal list of 5 Zelda titles we'd like to see Nintendo revisit. These could be straight remasters such as Twilight Princess HD, or more wholesale updates such as Link's Awakening on Switch. So without further ado, I'm John Rairdin, you're watching NWR TV, and these, in no particular order, are 5 Zelda games we'd like to see remade, remastered, or otherwise revisited. Number 1, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Over the years, we've heard plenty of people demand a remake of the very first Zelda, and Nintendo themselves have even explored the possibility of a remake with Capcom in the past. But the Zelda game that perhaps deserves some much-delayed attention more than any other is Zelda 2. This ambitious follow-up to the genre-defining classic released in Japan in 1987. It introduced full-on RPG systems such as experience points and level-ups that altered Link's stats. Like the original, it was entirely open world and largely non-linear. In fact, it would be the last Zelda game to be this open until Breath of the Wild returned the series to its classic design. Zelda 2 also placed an increased focus on story. The map was littered with towns full of villagers who could be spoken to for hints and lore. When it comes to bringing this game back, Zelda 2 would require a full overhaul, much like Metroid 2 received on 3DS. The original NES version was hampered by the limitations of the platform. Hints and objectives were often vague, and moments of the game were annoyingly obtuse. A full remake that brings Zelda 2 up to modern standards while maintaining its combo of top-down and side-scrolling gameplay could finally get this game the attention it deserves. Number 2, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword was a somewhat divisive Zelda game, as is seemingly any Nintendo game where complex motion controls are introduced for the first time. No, Twilight Princess on Wii doesn't count. For our money, however, Skyward Sword was incredible. Motion controls made for new and interesting gameplay mechanics and puzzles. The story is one of the best ever told in the entire series. Not to mention, Skyward Sword originally released as a celebration of Zelda's 25th anniversary. An HD version 10 years later feels very fitting. Visually, Skyward Sword honestly wouldn't need much. This could be a Twilight Princess-style remaster, with updated textures here and there, but mostly just a boost to a full 1080 by 1920 resolution. As for those motion controls, you bet we want them preserved on Switch. In addition, we'd love for a left-handed mode to finally give the option to put Link's sword back in its rightful place. As for handheld mode, an alternative control option could be made available, which would map the sword and other motion controls to the right stick, as Skyward Sword never offered full camera control anyway, so that stick would be otherwise unused. Number 3, The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages and Seasons. Alright, this one is kind of cheating because yes, these are 2 separate games, but in our imaginary remake, they both share the same cartridge. Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons were the first 2 of 3 Zelda games developed by Capcom. Like Link's Awakening DX, they helped continue the 2D line of Zelda, as Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask forged a new path into the 3D future. The Oracle games made use of the assets from Link's Awakening, and likewise, the Switch remake could use assets from Grezzo's Switch remake of Link's Awakening. Packaging these together would also allow for easy access to the Ganon fight previously only available by linking completed versions of both games. Perhaps they could even reintroduce some elements from the cancelled third Oracle game that never saw release. Like the adorable Link amiibo for Link's Awakening, Oracle of Ages and Seasons animal friends would make great additions to anyone's amiibo library. Number 4, The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures. If ever there were a Zelda game that plenty of fans didn't realize existed, let alone played, 4 Swords Adventures would be it. As a sequel to a side mode in the Game Boy Advance port of A Link to the Past, 4 Swords Adventures was always a bit of an odd sell. With optional multiplayer for up to 4 people, 4 Swords Adventures is probably the best multiplayer Zelda game ever made. Granted, that's not a high bar. It's also the most recent original, non-remake 2D Zelda to ever be made for a home console. That's right, there hasn't been a brand new 2D Zelda developed for a home console in 17 years. As for its re-release, Four Swords Adventures should maintain its 2D sprite work because, to be blunt, it's absolutely gorgeous. All Four Swords Adventures needs is to have those sprites redrawn at a higher resolution. The biggest change for this version would be the addition of optional online multiplayer. Better yet, an option to let players download a free version so they can play with a friend who owns the game. And hey, maybe if we want to get real crazy, allow people to use the GameCube adapter to plug their GBAs in and play just like the old days. Number 5, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. The final Zelda game made by Capcom, Minish Cap, is, in my opinion, the best 2D Zelda game ever made. It takes everything that worked about A Link to the Past and does it better. Then on top of that, it adds a ton of new items and a shrinking mechanic that makes the overworld a fascinating puzzle to explore. While all the Zelda games are great, Minish Cap is a masterpiece. So how do you improve it? Well, you don't. Much like Four Swords Adventures, Minish Cap should remain entirely 2D. Clean up the art with crisp new HD sprite work and backgrounds, and perhaps introduce the more dynamic camera used by Four Swords Adventures and Link's Awakening on Switch. Of course, the audio could use some cleanup too, given that the GBA didn't exactly output the highest fidelity sound. The main reason to remaster, remake, or otherwise re-release Minish Cap, though, is not because it needs a makeover, but simply so that more people can play one of Link's greatest adventures of all time. That's our list, but what do you think? Do you have other things you'd want remastered in these games, or would you want different games entirely? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Of course, if you enjoy our videos and want to make sure YouTube doesn't sneak them past you, make sure to click the notification bell. For more Zelda content, check out NintendoWorldReport.com, and if you want to chat with us about this or anything else Nintendo related, join us on Discord using the link in the description. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.